for dark nights.
My family just moved to the Midwest a few months ago from the coast, and this winter has been the first time I've ever seen snow. Growing up on the beach, I took great weather and sandy beaches for granted. I know a lot of people dream of vacationing in what was once my backyard, but to me, the most exciting thing in the world is snow. I was pretty excited when we moved here, and even more so when we got our first real snow just a few days ago. It began snowing while we were in class, and the first thing I did when we got out was to try and start a snowball fight. This only pissed off my friends, who I learned are sick of this stuff after having spent their whole lives surrounded by it, but I loved it. I didn't even mind learning the hard way that snow still melts outdoors, and that you'll have to walk the entire way home with freezing wet clothes. As soon as I got home, I changed my clothes and hung my light red jacket in my closet in favor of my only heavy coat. Even though I'm a teenager now and probably a bit too old for this kind of thing, I immediately ran outside and began building a snowman. Our house is at the end of a cul-de-sac, so I wasn't really worried about anyone seeing me, and I spent the rest of that afternoon sculpting a frozen doppelganger. The end result was slightly misshapen, but as far as first attempts go, I thought it was perfect. My parents went out to a Christmas party that evening and told me that they would not be back until late. I didn't think much of it because I usually spend my nights in my room either watching television or on the internet. It was the same story that night, and it was sometime after midnight when I fell asleep. I wasn't out for long, before a loud banging on the back door woke me up. My parents had come home drunk before, but never so drunk that they couldn't open the door. I began to head downstairs when I happened to glance out the window, expecting to see a familiar four-door sedan. There was no car in the driveway. I froze. The knocking got louder and faster. It sounded angry, almost desperate. I moved back towards my bed where my phone was, in case I would need to call the cops. The knocking got so loud that I thought the door was going to give way. I turned on my phone and began dialing the police, when the noise suddenly stopped. In the dreadful silence, I tried to hear any sounds over the thunder of my pulse. Nothing. Were they waiting outside the door? Then I heard the sound. A shrill, high-pitched moan, like air being slowly released from a balloon. It only sounded once, and there's a chance it was just my own breath caught in my tightened throat. Still, it left me shaking. For the rest of the night, I sat in my bed listening to the darkness and fighting off the idea that whoever it had been hadn't really left. Eventually, my parents came home, but as expected, they were hammered, and I knew there was no use trying to explain what I'd been through. The next morning, I discovered that someone had destroyed my snowman. Probably some of my friends, I thought. In a way, I was actually relieved. It all made sense then. Some of my friends must have come over the previous night, knocked down my snowman, and then banged on the door, trying to scare me because they knew my parents weren't home. I couldn't believe that I had let them scare me like that. The only thing that puzzled me was that they had written, "It's so cold outside," in the snow around my snowman. That afternoon after school, I ran straight home and rebuilt my snowman. I wasn't going to let my friends have the last laugh. That night, my parents stayed home and I didn't give a second thought to my friend's prank. Since it was Friday night, I was still awake long after my parents had gone to sleep. I was sitting at my computer when the knocking began again. It was quiet at first, but still sharp, like dry bones striking the door. I looked at the clock. It read 4 a.m. The knocking grew louder. I moved towards the window and looked out over the back porch. I could see a shadow standing at the door. Whoever, or whatever it was, it appeared to be very thin and was wrapped in black rags. Then I heard my dad moving downstairs. "Is someone knocking on the door?" he asked in a voice, then let me know he was still half asleep. "Yes, I can see someone out there," I yelled down the stairs. I heard him turn on the porch light, and I looked back out the window. The shadow had vanished, I saw my dad step out onto the porch. He stood there for a moment looking around before cursing the cold and going back to bed. The next morning, my snowman again lay in pieces, surrounded again by the words, "It's so cold outside." I wasn't sure what my friends were up to, but I nearly panicked when my parents told me that they were going to another Christmas party that night. I spent that Saturday afternoon rebuilding my snowman and even added a mother and father to make a snow family. As the sun began to set, I tried calling some of my friends to see if I could stay the night at their house, but all of them said that they were busy. "I'll bet you are," I thought snidely, confident that they were the ones responsible for the recent events. As soon as it got dark, I turned on the porch light and went upstairs to my room, certain that no one would dare knock on the door while the light was on. I watched some television, and before I knew it, I fell asleep. I was woken sometime later by the sound of heavy breathing. In the darkness of my room, it took me several seconds to realize that the breaths were my own. I inhaled deeply, trying to calm the anxiety that threatened to become panic any minute, but my pulse continued to race wildly. My eyes then began to adjust to the darkness. My room appeared to be empty, but I felt something. A presence weighing down on me. I knew that the television remote was beside my bed, but I also knew that if I moved even a single muscle, it would alert whatever was in my room that I was awake. I remained frozen. Even though I couldn't see a thing, I knew that something was moving, shifting in the darkness. I felt faint, as if I was about to pass out from the terror, my heart palpitating, threatening to stop altogether. As my head began to spin from the lack of oxygen being carried to it, I felt a blast of frigid air at my feet. The sensation crept slowly up my paralyzed body, the cold spreading from my legs to my chest, then to my constricted throat. It paused there, and suddenly I felt as though I was choking. It was too much. I don't know if it was my heart or my brain that gave out first, but in that final moment of terror, I slipped into unconsciousness. The sun was shining when I awoke the next morning, with a terrible headache. My temples throbbed as I made my way to the bathroom and then down to the kitchen. My parents were eating breakfast and looking slightly hungover. Everything appeared to be perfectly normal. I looked out the front window to see if my snow family had survived the night. The mother and father were missing, apparently dragged to the base of my front steps. For what reason, I had no idea. They had disappeared completely. I was about to call my friends and tell them to knock it off, that the joke had gone on long enough, when my eye caught sight of my original snowman, still in its original position, yet draped in something red. No, I thought, it couldn't be. I ran barefoot in my pajamas through the thick snow. I stopped at the base of my snowman and stared, aghast. I hardly felt the knife-like bite of the sub-zero temperatures against my skin as I struggled to make sense of the implications. The snowman was wearing my light red jacket, the same one I'd hung in my closet the day it first snowed. Anxiety hit me like a wave then, and everything afterwards was a blur. But I remember looking down long enough to make out the new messages that had been written in the snow, and I will never forget the crescendo of police car sirens, or the sound of my parents' muffled screams, as whatever came into my house flayed them, leaving what was left of them floating in pools of water and blood beneath the breakfast table. I remember I stared at the messages for what felt like hours, though it was probably just a few seconds. The first said, "We're still cold." The second, "You look so